Beneath the picture-perfect suburban life of Herbert Baumeister, a successful businessman in Indianapolis, Indiana, a secret waited in silence, hidden behind neatly trimmed lawns and the facade of an ordinary family. To neighbors, friends, and colleagues, Herbert was a man who had it all: a thriving business, a home in a quiet neighborhood, and a family that appeared normal. He was polite, articulate, and seemingly devoted. But behind the walls of his home, behind the locked doors of his house, something darker existed, a truth that would remain hidden for years. Herbert's marriage was troubled, but it appeared manageable to outsiders. On a night that would become pivotal, an argument with his wife escalated beyond control. In a moment of rage, Herbert attacked her, believing she had lost consciousness. Her life hung in the balance as she gasped for air, struggling for each breath. In that instant, Herbert froze. Panic replaced anger, and he stopped. She survived. The incident went unreported, buried in fear and shame, a secret kept from the world. This night, a near-death experience, would later become the key to unraveling Herbert Baumeister's hidden life. Years would pass before his wife would uncover disturbing items scattered around their property. It was her courage, her decision to finally involve the authorities, that set in motion a chain of events leading to the discovery of multiple men's remains buried on Herbert's estate. Men who had vanished, their disappearances once dismissed or forgotten, were suddenly linked to a single individual, a man living among them as a neighbor, a father, a businessman. The evidence that emerged was undeniable. Law enforcement, following leads and piecing together fragmented reports, uncovered a pattern of violence and secrecy that shocked the community. Herbert Baumeister's carefully constructed world of normalcy was revealed to be a cover for crimes that had gone undetected for years. The discovery of the bodies and the connection to Herbert himself transformed a quiet suburban street into a focal point of horror and investigation. In this episode, we will examine every aspect of Herbert Baumeister's life, the events that led to his exposure, and the investigation that brought his crimes to light. We will look at the critical moments, starting with the night his wife survived an attack that could have gone unnoticed forever, through the meticulous work of investigators who pieced together his pattern of murder. We will explore who Herbert Baumeister really was, and how one failed attempt would eventually reveal a string of atrocities he could no longer hide. If you follow these stories with attention, you will see the layers of deception, the quiet tensions within a seemingly ordinary life, and the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. If you are compelled by the unfolding of real cases, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because this story, the story of Herbert Baumeister, is one that demands attention. Herbert Baumeister was born in 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana, into a family that outwardly seemed ordinary. He grew up with access to education and opportunity, eventually establishing himself as a successful businessman. He owned a chain of retail stores and managed to maintain a public image of stability, competence, and social respectability. To those around him, Herbert was a man who had everything: a thriving career, a home in a quiet suburb, and a family that on the surface appeared normal. But behind closed doors, his life was far from ordinary. His marriage was marked by tension and arguments that escalated more frequently as the years went by. His wife, who had once hoped for a life of partnership and security, found herself increasingly at odds with Herbert. The argument that would lead to the near-fatal attack on her was not an isolated incident, but it would become the turning point, the moment that would eventually expose the darkness hidden beneath Herbert's carefully maintained exterior. Beyond his family, Herbert's interactions with others were outwardly typical, but there were subtle signs of a troubling pattern. Over the years, men, often young, vulnerable, and marginalized, began to disappear. These disappearances were scattered, not immediately connected, and in a time when missing persons reports, particularly involving gay men, were often overlooked or dismissed, they went largely unnoticed. Herbert's position in the community and his outwardly respectable life allowed him to avoid suspicion. The estate itself, a seemingly ordinary suburban property, held a secret world behind its walls and within its grounds. Herbert had constructed hidden spaces, areas that went unnoticed during casual observation. These spaces, combined with his methodical nature, allowed him to carry out acts that would remain undiscovered for years. It was a life that appeared orderly, normal, even enviable, while simultaneously concealing a reality that no one could have imagined. The historical context is important to understanding how Herbert Baumeister could operate without immediate detection. In the late 20th century, communities often trusted appearances, and law enforcement resources were limited in connecting missing persons across jurisdictions. The cultural stigma surrounding homosexuality further contributed to a lack of attention to the disappearances of gay men. These factors, combined with Herbert's careful planning and outward persona, created an environment in which his crimes could continue unnoticed. It was only when his wife discovered troubling evidence on their property after years of silence and fear that the truth began to surface. Items scattered around the estate, signs of disturbed ground and other anomalies prompted her to finally approach the authorities. This decision, driven by courage and intuition, would ultimately lead to the unmasking of Herbert Baumeister. In examining Herbert Baumeister's life, one sees the contrast between public perception and private reality. A businessman, a husband, a father, a neighbor, each role meticulously maintained, while beneath that mask, a calculated and deliberate series of actions remained hidden. The layers of his life, the control he exerted over his household, and the community's trust in his outward persona all contributed to the length of time his crimes remained undiscovered. The pieces were in place, but it would take the persistence and survival of his wife to set the investigation into motion. The night that would change everything began as an argument between Herbert Baumeister and his wife, a confrontation that escalated beyond the boundaries of ordinary marital discord. Words had been exchanged, harsh and angry, but in the heat of that moment, Herbert's actions crossed a line that would have ended in tragedy, if not for a single twist of fate. He attacked his wife, believing she had lost consciousness. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he had succeeded. But then she gasped. Her body struggled for life, her lungs drawing in air in a frantic attempt to survive. Herbert froze. Confusion replaced rage. The act that had begun with intent to kill ended abruptly, incomplete. His wife lived. The attack went unreported. It remained a secret, buried beneath fear, shame, and the fragile hope that life could continue without the world ever knowing. Years passed, but the violence of that night was only a single reflection of a much darker pattern. Herbert Baumeister had targeted other men who were vulnerable, often young and often alone. These men disappeared quietly without fanfare, leaving families with unanswered questions and communities with uneasy suspicions. Each disappearance added to a pattern, though at the time no one could see it clearly. Herbert's careful planning, his meticulous concealment of evidence, and his outwardly respectable life allowed him to operate in the shadows, invisible in plain sight. The methods Herbert employed were methodical and calculated. He lured his victims through personal connections, through apparent kindness, through offers of companionship that masked his true intentions. Once he had isolated them, the acts that followed were deliberate, leaving little evidence to trace. His property became a repository for the missing, a place where the boundaries between the ordinary and the horrific were carefully maintained, hidden beneath lawns and within secluded areas of the estate. The failed attack on his wife, though, became a turning point in the narrative of his crimes. Her survival meant that there was at least one person who had experienced the violent capacity of Herbert Baumeister firsthand. And when years later she discovered items and signs that did not belong, signs that suggested something far worse than she could have imagined, she went to the authorities. That decision, born of courage and intuition, would open the door to uncovering multiple murders. Investigators would later find that Herbert's crimes were not random. They followed patterns, traces of obsession and meticulous concealment. Each missing man, each disturbed site on his property, told a story that slowly came together to reveal the scale of his actions. The quiet neighborhood that had appeared so ordinary, the home that had seemed unremarkable, were in fact central to a chain of violence that had remained hidden for years. The chilling reality is that Herbert Baumeister could have continued without detection indefinitely. His outward appearance, his careful maintenance of family and business life, and the assumptions of those around him created a protective veil. Only the near-fatal attack on his wife and her eventual decision to speak out broke that veil, setting in motion the events that would expose a killer who had lived among the unsuspecting, hiding the true extent of his crimes behind a facade of normalcy. The investigation into Herbert Baumeister's crimes began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a simple report from a woman who had survived an attack she never thought she would share. Her concerns about unusual items and disturbances on the family property drew the attention of local law enforcement. At first, the complaints seemed isolated, minor anomalies that could be dismissed as eccentricities. But as officers began to observe the property and question neighbors, it became apparent that there was something more. The first step was a careful examination of the estate. Law enforcement officers noted areas that appeared disturbed, patches of ground that had been recently altered, and structures that seemed out of place in an otherwise orderly suburban yard. Their attention turned to the patterns of Herbert Baumeister's life, his routines, his associates, and the men he had been seen with over the years. What emerged was a map of opportunity, a series of connections between the missing and the man who lived among them. Investigators began cross-referencing reports of missing persons, many of whom were young men who had disappeared without explanation over a period of years. They discovered that these men shared certain characteristics, often overlapping in social circles, and in some cases, frequenting the same neighborhoods as Herbert Baumeister. Each lead was carefully followed. Officers conducted interviews, revisited old cases, and scrutinized Herbert's movements, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Forensic teams were called to examine the property in detail. Soil samples, ground disturbances, and other environmental evidence were carefully catalogued. It was a painstaking process, slow and meticulous, as the investigators attempted to determine whether any missing persons might have been buried or hidden on the estate. Every detail mattered: the placement of objects, the condition of landscaping, even minor irregularities that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Herbert Baumeister had been operating in a methodical and controlled manner. He left little direct evidence and took steps to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Yet small mistakes and overlooked details began to surface. Witnesses recalled seeing men with him under circumstances that in retrospect seemed suspicious. Old acquaintances and neighbors provided accounts that, when pieced together, formed a picture of a man capable of calculating violence while maintaining a veneer of everyday life. Public awareness of the investigation grew slowly, fueled by cautious media coverage. Authorities were careful not to release details prematurely, understanding the sensitivity of the case and the potential for panic. Meanwhile, Herbert continued to present himself as a businessman, a husband, a member of the community, oblivious to the scrutiny that had begun to encroach upon his carefully constructed world. The breakthrough came when investigators began uncovering human remains buried on the property. Each discovery confirmed suspicions, linking Herbert Baumeister to multiple missing persons cases. The evidence was undeniable, and the investigation shifted from cautious inquiry to a full-scale search for the truth. What had begun as a single report, a moment of courage from a woman who had survived, became a comprehensive unraveling of years of hidden violence. By the time the investigation concluded, law enforcement had amassed a clear and troubling understanding of Herbert Baumeister's crimes. The quiet streets of Indianapolis would never again be seen in the same way, and the story of one man's duplicity would leave a permanent mark on the community. The investigation had exposed the depth of his actions, the lives affected, and the consequences of living a life hidden behind appearances. Once the extent of Herbert Baumeister's crimes became known, the attention of law enforcement, the community, and the nation focused squarely on him. By the time authorities were ready to bring charges, the scope of his actions was staggering. Multiple men had been murdered, their remains buried on his property, and investigators faced the daunting task of connecting each death to a single perpetrator. The legal proceedings were set against the backdrop of a community struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred in their midst. Herbert Baumeister, however, was not alive to face trial. In May of 1996, after the investigation had closed in and the evidence mounted, he took his own life, leaving the court without the chance to pass judgment in a traditional sense. His death did not end the case. Rather, it shifted the focus entirely to the work of investigators, forensic experts, and the grieving families seeking answers. The courtroom, which might have been a venue for testimony and confrontation, became instead a place where the evidence would be reviewed and analyzed, piecing together a narrative of his crimes for the historical record. Authorities presented detailed accounts of his life and actions, linking him to the disappearances and murders of multiple men. The discovery of human remains on his property was central to this narrative. Forensic examinations established identities where possible, confirmed causes of death, and reconstructed timelines that placed Herbert Baumeister at the center of each crime. Investigators emphasized the methodical nature of his actions, the careful concealment, and the repeated patterns that demonstrated premeditation. Witnesses were interviewed extensively, including neighbors, friends, and family members. Each account contributed to a comprehensive picture of Herbert Baumeister as a man who lived a dual life, publicly respectable, privately violent. His wife's survival and eventual decision to report suspicious items became a focal point in understanding how the crimes came to light. Her testimony, combined with the forensic evidence, highlighted the fragility of the facade he had maintained for so long. Media coverage during this period reflected a mix of fascination, horror, and disbelief. Reporters chronicled the story with care, recounting each discovery and investigation step. The community's reaction was a mixture of grief and shock. Families of victims, many of whom had endured years of uncertainty, finally received confirmation of their loved ones' fates. The revelations forced the public to confront the reality that someone who had appeared normal, even ordinary, had orchestrated acts of extreme violence within their midst. Although Herbert Baumeister would never face a formal trial, the presentation of evidence created a posthumous understanding of his crimes. Legal authorities documented each finding, ensuring that the record would remain clear and detailed. The narrative that emerged was undeniable. Herbert Baumeister had taken multiple lives, hidden them meticulously, and lived undetected until his own actions and decisions, his wife's survival and his eventual suicide, brought the full scope of his crimes to light. The verdict, in a sense, was written not in a courtroom, but in the evidence itself. The lives of his victims, the testimony of his wife, and the work of law enforcement combined to reveal the truth. Herbert Baumeister's actions would be remembered as a stark example of how appearances can deceive, and how a single act of courage, his wife reporting the suspicious activity, was enough to uncover a series of murders that might otherwise have remained buried forever. The aftermath of Herbert Baumeister's actions left a profound mark on the community. The families of the victims and the law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Indianapolis, once a quiet suburban setting of routine and familiarity, became a place haunted by questions of how such violence could persist unnoticed for so many years. The revelation that a man who had appeared ordinary, even respected, had orchestrated multiple murders forced the community to confront the unsettling reality that danger often hides behind the most mundane appearances. Families of the victims, some of whom had spent years hoping for answers, were finally confronted with confirmation of the fates of their loved ones. Grief was mingled with relief, the knowledge that their relatives had not vanished without explanation, and that investigators had been able to locate remains, however incomplete the recovery. The emotional toll was immense. Some families found closure in the forensic confirmation, while others were left with lingering questions about those whose remains were never recovered. Each discovery, each burial site, became a testament to both the lives lost and the perseverance of those seeking justice. The surviving wife of Herbert Baumeister played a pivotal role in the unfolding of these events. Her courage in reporting anomalies on their property had initiated the investigation that ultimately revealed his crimes. In the aftermath, she continued to grapple with the psychological impact of her near-fatal encounter and the years spent in proximity to a man capable of such calculated violence. Her experience underscored the complexity of victimhood and survival, and the consequences of living alongside someone whose public persona masked lethal intent. Law enforcement and investigators also reflected on the lessons learned from the Baumeister case. The need for improved tracking of missing persons, better coordination between jurisdictions, and heightened attention to patterns in unexplained disappearances became evident. Procedures were revised, practices updated, and awareness raised regarding the vulnerabilities of certain populations. In many ways, the investigation into Herbert Baumeister's actions reshaped law enforcement approaches, demonstrating both the challenges and the necessity of thorough, persistent inquiry. Theories emerged as the case was studied in the years following Baumeister's death. Some questioned whether all victims had been identified or if others remained undiscovered. Analysts examined patterns in his behavior, considering psychological motives, the selection of victims, and the methods of concealment. While certain aspects of his actions could be inferred from evidence and testimony, gaps remained. Questions lingered about how long he might have continued, had his wife not survived, and how many lives might have been altered or ended before discovery. Among the theories, the most compelling is that Herbert Baumeister operated with a deliberate understanding of both human behavior and law enforcement limitations. He relied on societal assumptions, the trust of neighbors, and the invisibility of marginalized communities to carry out his crimes. The combination of careful planning and the survival of his wife ultimately determined the exposure of his actions. The chilling reality remains. One act of courage, one decision to report anomalies, is what brought to light a series of murders that could have otherwise remained buried indefinitely. Herbert Baumeister's legacy is a complex blend of tragedy, horror, and revelation. The community, investigators, and families were forever changed. The story of his crimes serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of perception, the importance of vigilance, and the decisive role that even a single voice can play in uncovering the truth. The story of Herbert Baumeister forces a confrontation with questions that extend far beyond the crimes themselves. How could a man so outwardly normal, a father, a businessman, a member of a quiet Indiana community, conceal such calculated violence for so many years? What does it reveal about the assumptions we make about appearances, about trust, and about the lives of those who live quietly on the margins of society? These are questions that linger long after the investigation concludes, and they shape the way communities remember, analyze, and learn from events like these. Herbert Baumeister's wife, whose survival became the catalyst for uncovering his murders, illustrates the profound impact of courage and observation. Without her intervention, it is likely that the crimes he committed would have remained hidden indefinitely. Her decision to report unusual items on their property demonstrates the pivotal role that individuals can play in exposing violence, even when that violence exists behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. Her survival was more than chance. It became the key that unlocked the truth. The case also left an indelible mark on law enforcement. Investigators had to navigate years of missing persons reports, fragmented evidence, and a society that often overlooked disappearances of certain populations. Their work demonstrated the necessity of persistence, attention to detail, and the ability to connect disparate pieces of information over time. The lessons learned in the investigation into Herbert Baumeister's crimes influenced future protocols for missing persons cases and reinforced the importance of examining patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. Communities affected by his actions were forced to grapple with a new understanding of safety and trust. Neighborhoods that had appeared secure, families that had felt protected, and social networks that had been confident in the decency of those around them were suddenly confronted with the reality that deception can exist behind the most ordinary facades. The disruption caused by the revelation of Herbert Baumeister's crimes extended beyond the immediate victims. It reached into the perceptions and daily lives of an entire community. Even now, questions remain. How many of his victims were never found? How many lives might have been spared if subtle warning signs had been recognized earlier? The case encourages reflection on human behavior, on the capacity for secrecy, and on the consequences of both action and inaction. It challenges us to consider the ways in which we observe the world around us, the assumptions we make about others, and the importance of vigilance in protecting those who are vulnerable. Ultimately, the story of Herbert Baumeister is a stark reminder of the thin line between appearance and reality, between life and death. It underscores the fragility of trust and the power of individual courage to uncover truth. It demonstrates that even in the quietest communities, unimaginable acts can be occurring in silence, waiting for discovery. As we reflect on these events, the question is left to the viewer. What do we truly know about the people around us, and how might our awareness change the course of hidden events? Herbert Baumeister's life, crimes, and exposure are a narrative of ordinary life colliding with extraordinary horror, and the consequences of living among secrets that demand to be revealed. If this story has captured your attention, remember the importance of observation, the courage to speak out, and the enduring significance of uncovering the truth. Cases like Herbert Baumeister's leave a permanent mark, reminding us that even one voice, one act of awareness, can bring darkness into the light.